I'm John Byrne with AML RightSource, and with me today is Hanjo Seibert, and he is the Managing Director and Partner for the Boston Consulting Group. Long time experience in both compliance and technology and areas that we all care about in the AML and adjacent communities. Hanjo, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking time. I know you're extremely busy. There's a lot going on. Let me start with the broad question. And the question is, in 2025 versus if we had this conversation 20 years ago, technology is so much more important to successful compliance. When a client or potential client reaches out to you and say, we're trying to figure out, let's say a mid-sized institution, a fintech, a traditional bank, whatever, walk us through your discussion with them about the value proposition of technology to help successful compliance.
Sure. Hi, John. Happy to be here. Great question. So I think 20 years ago, it was pretty much still the same discussion. I think the weighting has, however, shifted completely between the components, right? Where 20 years ago, it was probably first a policy framework and where do I actually put compliance or anti-financial crime prevention? Do I put it under legal? Where do I put it? This type of discussion. And then secondary was the discussion on, what data do I actually have? What data do I need? And do I have some technologies? And we all know all the technologies that have been around for 20, 30 years in transaction monitoring, screening, etc. So it is not that 20 years ago it wasn't a tech discussion. It was usually just a technology came second. Nowadays, if I would get the same request as per your example, I think it's very often leading with technology. So I think it shows just how important and how vast and broad and deep the technology discussion in compliance and in anti-financial crime has become. And interestingly so, I think nowadays sometimes even I need to stop some clients, or not only clients, but also within BCG internally, or generally people in the market, to not only talk technology and innovation and AI and bring it back to the fundamentals of the business. So what do I want to achieve? What's my core mission, as you gave the example of a bank? Like, first and foremost, I'm a bank, but what's my role in fighting economic crime, in ensuring compliance, in all of these things? Have I really understood, or am I trying to talk about technology and AI because it's quote unquote fancy? Or have I understood, okay, if I do this, it helps me better detect my risks, so it helps me on my effectiveness, or certain things help me on my efficiency, which again should help me on my effectiveness because things get more transparent, more standardized, more streamlined, and that should also effectively help on effectiveness. So it's almost on the pendulum has swung thus far that everyone wants to talk technology, and we need to remind them sometimes, look, let's come from the business problem that we want to solve, and technology is a very powerful tool, and actually more than one tool, a set of tools, but it is a couple of tools, and you need to have the right tool for the right problem, right? Not everything is a nail, not every tool is a hammer, but it is a very, very powerful one. But in short, yes, technology is left, right, and center of any discussion we have these days.
It's interesting when I've talked to law enforcement folks regarding surveillance, transaction monitoring, the use of technology as it continues to improve. They always say sort of the same thing. They say it's important to have those various tools, again, depending on what your goal is. But at the end of the day, you still want to have I'll call it human intervention. You want somebody with an investigative background, somebody that knows, an analyst that knows what they're looking at, that sort of thing. So even though I've seen some evidence of how AI has been used in a variety of spaces, and I'm sure you have as well, having that, I won't call them guardrails, but that oversight is also, at least our law enforcement partners believe that's fairly essential. What about in your world?
Absolutely. I mean, couldn't agree more. I think to me, it comes down to what we would call the diverse teams. And like, I know a lot of buzzwords and so on, but really from experience to say, you need to have the law enforcement people. You need to have the risk management people, which is also often forgotten. You need to have ideally the data people and the data science people. And to me, there's a distinction between data engineers or data people and data science people. So in the ideal setting, you have a diverse team, and they support one another and they learn from one another, right? Because also a enforcement person can learn something about, oh, this is what's happening in the data with a, say, 10 million customer with a 2 billion transactions from the data scientists. But the data scientists also, as you said, need the law enforcement people. Maybe one funny anecdote, I find it funny anecdote from my project life. A couple of years ago, we're doing like machine learning models. So think of random forest models for transaction monitoring. And we had a data science team, and they were kind of working on their own for a week. And I was getting nervous because, back to the point, A needs to speak to B. And so when I was checking in with them, they showed me like the models and the results they had, and so we were digging deeper into it. And I was wondering, like, so how do you come to this? And they were pitching the results of the model. Oh, this is so much better. Look at this. And so from a statistical perspective, the random forest model was much better. But what they had done is they had calibrated the so-called reward function in a way where false positive, false negative, they'd given an equal weight to both. Not understanding that, hey, if I miss a money launderer or a terrorist financing act, it's basically the same severity as if I have a false positive. Right. So to me, and then we unwinded it and updated the model. But to me, this is a great example because, like, from a statistical perspective, you wouldn't care that much, right? From a law enforcement, from a legal perspective, you'd say, of course, I want to detect the terrorists, the drug traffickers, etc., and so on. And that's where I think this combination is required on what is actually the impact. Is it worse to miss one here, or is it worse to create more volume over here? And in very good teams, I think they've managed that all of the different people with the different backgrounds come together and speak one language and also work together as a team. And that's where really the power of that diverse setting and diverse skill set lies.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Let's talk about compliance. I've spent my career in compliance, and you've done very similar work, obviously. I remember being at a financial institution for a couple of years, and the tagline on the email that you were to send around with your messaging was "Compliance is everybody's business," and a lot of banks do similar things, to keep the sort of the tone at the top and the tone in the middle strong. But also, I do recall being in an institution, and also when I was at the Bankers Association, the notion was that compliance was a cost center. Compliance was an area where we got to spend resources maybe to protect us, but really we're sort of doing record keeping and reporting, and the debates on what's the value proposition, which we'll leave to others to talk about. But internally, there was always sort of that back and forth, the lines of business. Why do we need to spend money on X? And then when you go, if you're not part of the leadership team, you go to leadership, you go to the chief risk officer or whatever, say, I need X amount of dollars because I'm doing this, or X amount of bodies on a project, and that sort of thing. So there's always that push and pull. When they call you in and your colleagues in to talk about elevating or adding to the compliance resources, what are some of the things that you raise, and what's some advice that you give other compliance officers? Here's how you make your case. And I would argue, like I said, they call it a cost center. I'd say in many cases it's a cost saving center, but I'm really curious of your perspective.
No, great question. And I certainly recognize both of the angles that you were mentioning. So from my heart, I agree with the first one. I think compliance is everybody's business. And in the same way, right? All the laws that apply to me, I'm not supposed to murder anyone. I'm not supposed to do anything wrong. And I can't call it on the police. Oh, it's their job. Well, it's my job as a citizen to not commit the crimes and be knowledgeable about what's lawful and what's not lawful. So I do think that this is very much an obligation that applies to, quote unquote, the first line, or to everyone in the organization. Right. Now, to this point of cost center, I guess it is a cost center in some way, right? If you just see it in the classical sense, because there's very little revenues being earned, you could for sure try to come up with cost avoidance as to, okay, what do other peer institutions get fined, or what's the cost of compliance when they get a monitorship in, and that cost is enormous. The problem there, I think, is usually it is such a lower well, probably not lower likelihood, but very bifurcated scenario, right? Because if it happens, then it's a pretty big, hefty impact, and it's very hard to explain to someone who hasn't felt the pressure what that pressure is about. My perspective and what I would discuss, and this is actually half-half. I have half of these discussions with compliance professionals, and the other half with executives, like that are non in compliance,
Right.
is to say, if you take a step back and look at what do you want to achieve as a business and how do you want to achieve it, in also talking about sustainability, I think the question or the discussion becomes very quickly one, I want to do business in a robust way, which means I don't want to be dragged down by non-compliance every other month. So to say, how do I achieve compliance by design? And then have this discussion of what's my quote unquote risk appetite, but what is the model and the market I'm operating in, and what do I need to have in place to sustainably grow and conduct business in that field? And maybe more practically, we advised a bank where exactly that was happening, right? The business was frustrated about compliance because they thought, oh, compliance is a cost center and compliance is stopping me in doing business. Compliance was frustrated because they said the business doesn't understand. Now, what we then made sure in getting leadership more together, aligning the incentives between business and compliance, is to say, look, how do you want to sell products? How do you want to serve your customers? And what is the compliant way by design again? The thing that really worked well there is that over the course of this engagement, compliance was called in much earlier in the process by business into a discussion, not into a decision that then they could veto or not, which always gave frustration on whatever end. The other part that business realized, if they leverage the insights from compliance on KYC, because what it effectively means, know your customer or know your client, is actually a value statement to the business. Because if I know my client well, if I know corporate actions well, if I know change in ownership, if I know all these things well, we have a discussion on how can I use it, but taking that aside, if I know all that well, I can do a better job servicing my clients and customers. And the last part, a discussion on what I thought was actually profitable. Is that actually profitable if I calculate all the costs? And yes, compliance is a cost center, but it's not a cost center that just creates cost on its own will. It's associated to the business. So when we did the analysis, there was actually a lot of international complex banking products that weren't profitable anymore, where then from a business perspective, the bank had the decision and the consideration, do I actually want to maintain some foreign markets? Do I want to maintain the diversity and complexity of the product mix, or do I want to standardize products so that also the cost of compliance, but also the business cost of maintaining such a diverse thing where I tailor-made everything to the individual client goes away a little bit, and therefore also the cost reduces, the transparency increases, and the scalability increases. So with all of that, I think it's a dialogue, but at the end of the day, acknowledging that compliance is there to stay. Compliance is part of the whole product and customer service consideration. It's not an afterthought.
In the early days of compliance in my career, I could remember the example that we would always use as a bad example because it had occurred a few times, mainly in smaller banks. But on a Friday before a Monday product rollout, that's when the compliance officer he or she would be told, starting Monday, we're going to offer this product. But to your point, if they're at the table early on, not that they're going to say no, but they can offer you suggestions on how to move with it. You've already made the business decision that you want that particular product, and hopefully by consulting compliance to see what sort of regulatory issues there may be. But having them part of the process just makes it go so much smoother, I guess, is the way to characterize it. So
exactly. And I mean, if you involve compliance on the Friday before the Monday, the only thing that they can say is no. If you involve them earlier, it can be a actually quite constructive discussion on, hey, we have some questions here, or this might not work in this way. Let's consider doing it in a different way, or we need more transparency and documents from the customer, or we need a consent from the customer in order to do this in that way, etc., and so on. So yes, I think the early on dialogue is much preferred compared to the involving them as an afterthought.
Let's shift gears. One of the other areas that we pay a lot of attention to, and in fact, we're going to be we did a program back in October, and we're doing one in April, and that's looking at fraud, not versus anti-money laundering, but understanding that fraud is a key component for the compliance officer. And we've talked offline a bit about keeping up with the fraudsters. So talk both from a technology standpoint and just in general, the need for institutions to, I don't say they have to combine the two, but certainly collaborate with those that deal with fraud prevention and those deal with the broader money laundering issues, but both from a technology standpoint and then just from a governance standpoint. What would you recommend if we call you in and say, hey, these groups are siloed. How do we work together?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is again a great question. Something that I think we could probably speak about for a whole day.
Right. Yeah.
Let me break it out in a couple of points. Keeping pace with fraudsters, I think that's the big challenge, right? For everyone in the industry, because most of the fraudsters that we know, they don't work in very large organizations with departments and silos and so on. So keeping pace just with that is a challenge, full stop. Second, the quote unquote innovation of fraud or crime scenarios or exposures. I think the underlying hasn't changed. I think the way in how you can conduct it, that has changed over time. And you can take some of the tech innovation like instant payments, cryptos, alternative PSPs, money service banks, etc. into this. So it's always a question on what is the weakest chain in the link. And very often when there is disruptive technology, when there is innovation in the market, new market entrants, there's usually a new weak link that emerges from that. So I think exploiting that has become quite a solid business case for fraudsters over the last 10 years at minimum. The other part is the evolution and disruption of technology that they can use directly for conducting their fraud. Example, Gen AI, and my best example is all the training that everyone I think has gotten and still gets on phishing. Mm-hmm. Phishing attempts where it's always look for weak language, look for typos, etc. And I mean, all those are gone with Gen AI, right? If that's leveraged well, I mean, you still have this type of urgency, requests, sending money, etc. But this whole like look out for emails with typos. I mean, why should this still exist when Gen AI can write better letters than any human can, right? So there's this notion of it hyperscales for some of the frauds. It also takes some of the quote unquote rules away that we've learned and that are kind of rolled out in some of the trainings that fraudsters are employing in the same way, if not even faster than some of the organizations, because they don't have model risk management. They don't have validation teams. They don't have the silos, and they don't have the governance reporting lines that they have to adhere to. On your second part of the question, I think this whole like working together, I would say absolutely. And if I even just think of, and in most jurisdictions, this is also from a regulatory perspective, a well-established link as fraud being a predicate offense to money laundering. I mean, even just from there, I think it's a no-brainer to see you got to work together. If you look at the data, to 90%, when we look at this fraud, anti-money laundering, etc., they use the same underlying data to try to detect money laundering, terrorist financing, fraud, etc. Now, the big question comes, like, how do I put this together? And like, there's obviously ways in moving fraud and AML departments and cyber departments closer together, or moving it very close together from a second line perspective, and then keeping it sort of separate more in the operational and in the business side. Whatever form you use, or whether you call it, I think there's some US banks who call it fusion approach, or US and Canadian, so North American banks. almost does not matter to me. I think for me, the key exam question is how closely are the different disciplines collaborating and how effectively are they collaborating? Because to me, underlining is the key principle is they need to work closer together. Yet on the other hand, they there is some domain expertise which quote unquote only applies to AML versus only applies to fraud. But then there's also, and this is what I would be worried about most, the common penetration threats, as in where it is a fraud and a money laundering, or it is a defrauded account on which money is laundered, or whatever else combination there is. So I think a lot of the exposure is not the singular AML exposure or the single account takeover fraud or the single whatever threat. It's a combination of things that all go between the cracks in each of the different risk silos, if you will, but combined, they tell a pretty clear story. So the question for the organization is how do you collaborate across the different centers of excellence, I want to call it, instead of silos, but across the centers of excellence to be able to see that story and focus on that rather than saying it wasn't a pure AML thing, it wasn't a pure credit thing, it wasn't a pure fraud thing, but hey, combining it, it's a pretty clear story.
The last category I want to ask you about is sort of everything we've talked about leads up to this, and that's the notion if you're going to do this collaboration, this connecting, communication is key, right? Communication internally, communication with your supervisors, your regulators, communication potentially with outside firms that are going to navigate what legal restrictions there might be. What are some of the recommendations that you make to institutions regarding what I'll just call from a high level information sharing, because that could be a rump group of other banks that are sharing information on processes. This could be a private-public partnership where you're working with law enforcement partners. It could be working with, again, your regulators because you want them to sort of bless what you've put together. Talk about the importance of information sharing and what some of the challenges to navigate that so you're allowed to share as much as is feasible.
And this is to me one of the holy grails in the market in a way, because it's such a disconnect for me for decades between the value statement, which is super clear in my view, as to there's only positive for any good actor in the market, there's only positive benefits from sharing information and creating transparency. On the other hand, I think no market, no conglomerate, no utility, no whatever you name it, has achieved it in any jurisdiction that I could think of, whilst the value proposition is so clear. So if you ask me, is there value? Absolutely. Do I think that private market participants can solve it by themselves? Personally, I'm skeptical because I've seen it for the last 15 years and all the ambitions have always stopped short or failed. I've seen some discussions in the public-private collaboration, but a lot of them have also stalled, right? And there's some markets, and I don't want to reference to individual countries now, but there's been some markets who have discussed it also with the local ministries of finance. Very good approaches, very, very good ideas that got me very excited. In the end, for one reason or the other, they always stopped and didn't implement it in the rigidity that they would have to implement it to make it a group-wide market standard for their respective market. But I do think the potential is absolutely there. If we as a society want to get to the next level of combating fraud, financial crime, and cyber frauds, we got to get to better information sharing. We got to get to better transparency, and we got to get to a more quote unquote utility approach where not everyone is doing exactly the same, where we need to understand it's usually not a competitive advantage to do KYC well. It's an underlining, and it is something where we together, but each country probably individually, we got to recognize that it helps us strengthening the marketplace. So the big question is who takes up the charge on or who leads the charge on let's make either a couple of countries or a specific country a safer, stronger, more robust, more transparent marketplace.
Hanyo, I really appreciate your time today. Let me get you out of here on this. As we record in March of 2025, there's a lot of moving chairs, we'll put it that way, right? Both in the US and globally. And compliance is a global issue. We're a global company. You work with global entities, so you don't always make adjustments in compliance based on what one jurisdiction is doing. But having said that, obviously there's been a lot of activity within the US. Without prejudicing your answer, one of the things that we've seen and we've heard law firms say the same thing, regardless of what might seem to be a new priority. A lot of these laws and regs have statutes of limitation that go beyond a particular administration or what have you. So it's not the time to relinquish your compliance response, but to be more, I don't want to say more focused, but be aware of where the priorities are of your supervisors. Just in general, high level, where do you see both, not just here in the States, but just globally, the world of compliance, because technology is so important, as you've already mentioned. So I think that's always going to be an important tool. But if I'm calling you up and saying, I want you guys to come in here, give us some recommendations on how for the next 12 months, the next 18 months, what we should be doing. Very high level, what would you tell us?
Sure, absolutely. Just for reference, we're recording beginning of March, so anything
Right.
that I might now say might look
Right.
silly in light of the month to come. But without going into any specific politics or any specific country, I would say number one is I think we see much, much more uncertainty and volatility in the world, and I think that's a no-brainer.
Right.
The big question is like, how do you price in volatility and uncertainty, and how can you create more optionality in your path forward? Because like we used to say we can't forecast 10 years, then we said we can't forecast 5 years. Now I dare even to forecast 12 months, as you were asking. So I think one of the questions is, how can you place more optionality into your roadmap and in your plan? And then concretely speaking on some of the events that happened over the weekend that I think you're referring to is, I would say if we all take a step back and also like think about what we just discussed in terms of being additive to the business, being a partner to the business, and so on, I think maybe reduced harshness, if one could say this, in enforcement from a US perspective, if that is ever the outcome of what has been happening over the weekend. One could also say, and because I could also speak for an hour now about all the bad things there, but if we take it as a chance to say, well, self-regulation in some way does not mean that there should be an end of regulation in that sense, but maybe one could see this as, hey, there might be more degrees of freedom now to think about what should I actually be doing, and come more from an outcomes perspective rather than being super nervous on a single transaction in an international payment that went out 3 years ago. So to say, well, the same principles I think still apply regardless of what country A or country B does. What does it now mean for my business? And now maybe I have more room to breathe to say, what do I really want to achieve, and how do I structurally do it? And maybe now I have time for all the tech investments that I didn't have because I was rushing compliance with this regulation, answering to this supervisor or that supervisor. So I think the demand on being compliant does not go away, and the expectation from public to institutions especially does not go away. And how do you then use this to channel the monies of the dollars of investment in a way that is value adding for you as a company, for your stakeholders, but also in to some extent for society at large, because that part does not go away.
That's great advice. Obviously, smart people will figure out opportunities in every challenge, and I think that's clearly the direction that you're recommending folks take a look at. And again, we don't know what things will be like in the next couple weeks or couple months, but staying on top and paying attention becomes really, really important. So, Hanyo, thank you so much for your time. He's with the Boston Consulting Group. More information on the firm, bcg.com. Thanks again for taking the time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, John.